Policy Forum's 2020 Census webinar. My name is Roberto Valdez Jr., and I am the Associate Director of External Affairs for the Latino Policy Forum. In just a few minutes, I will be providing you with the analysis of Census 2020 data that was conducted by the Latino Policy Forum. I will also be moderating today's wonderful panel discussion. I'll introduce those panelists after my presentation. I think you can see their names on the screen, but nonetheless, I'll make sure to give a formal introduction after the presentation. After close to a year of waiting for Census 2020 data to be released, in August of this year, which was only really a few weeks ago, we finally got to see the results of all the hard work that was done by so many community members, so many organizations, our elected officials, and others in government and philanthropy. Before I get into the presentation, I really want to take a second and thank all those who were involved in census outreach efforts. Today, I plan to provide a high-level presentation and analysis of what we know about the 2020 census data and what it reveals about the Latino community at state, local, and national perspectives. By reviewing this analysis and this data, I think it really will help better understand what investments are needed in our Latino community, both state and national wise, as well as what it means for policy and political implications. Go ahead and get into our presentation for today. Let's see here. Okay, great. Perfect. As mentioned, I will be conducting the presentation today, but I also want to give a huge shout out to our Director of Research, Noreen Segru, who really collected the data and really assisted in collecting or putting this presentation together. Just an overview of what we're going to do for the next 50 plus minutes here. I'll conduct a presentation in just a sec. We'll also have a presentation from our panelists that's joining us from the NALEO Educational Fund. We'll have some panelist takeaways around what's being presented. And then of course, we want to hear from you, any questions, comments around what's presented, or anything that's on your mind regarding the Census 2020 data, or anything that's talked about. Want to hear from you. Do encourage folks to put questions, comments, either in the chat box or in the Q&A box. We've done plenty of these webinars by now, so I think folks are familiar with that process. So some context, a lot of this information is very familiar. About $20 billion in federal funding comes to Illinois each year in dollars that are allocated by the US Census data. Some of that funding supports programs like Medicaid, highway infrastructure, programs that aid low-income households, but also communities, rural communities, and communities of color. We know that the state of Illinois, throughout the 2-year span between 2019 and 2020, appropriated about $48 million for census outreach, education, and mobilization. The forum specifically was part of the Illinois Count Me In 2020 coalition, which many of you know is a statewide coalition that focused on outreach, hard to count communities, providing safe spaces for self-reporting purposes, and it really helped educate the Get Out the Count efforts. And again, thank you for all those who were part of those efforts. Specifically, the forum also had a campaign that was titled Strength in Numbers, which really included many facets of a campaign. It had in-person and virtual census presentations. It had a comprehensive social media campaign in English and in Spanish that had toolkits that were provided to community organizations and anyone who wanted to put information out on the census. We developed fact sheets in English and Spanish around the census. And my favorite, we developed the Census Loteria set. Folks can still see all the work that the forum did throughout really a 2-year span at tucenso.com. And we'll make sure to put that link in the chat so you can check out that work. Wanted to highlight the tablas or the tablets that were used during our Loteria set. Very innovative and creative way for us to engage with the community and educate folks around the census. We did get a lot of positive feedback around this. So, kudos to our team at the forum for developing this and really enhancing its portfolio. So let's get into the data. I'm sure folks are here for that. Briefly around national data, some of this I'm sure you're very, very aware of. Looking at the US population by race and ethnicity in 2020. In 2020, the number of Latinos living in the US was 62,080,044 individuals, or 19% of the nation's total population. Other race and ethnicities include white at 58%, Black at 12%, Asian at 6%, and other ethnicities and races at 5%. Here, you see the change in the number of people living in the US by race and ethnicity from 2010 to 2020. Between that 10-year gap, the Latino US population grew by 11,602,462 individuals, or 3.5%. You'll also notice that Latinos did have the largest growth of any race and ethnicity in the country. This is a slide from our friends from NALEO. This slide will also be expanded on by one of our panelists who I'll introduce in just a sec. But essentially, it does show the Latino population growth for selected states from 2010 to 2020. You'll notice that Illinois there is fifth in total Latino population. It is behind Texas, New York, California, and Florida. And again, we'll revisit this slide in just a few minutes. Let's pivot to Illinois data. Illinois is one of 3 states to unfortunately experience a decline in total population over the last 10 years, losing just over 18,000 individuals. The other states include Mississippi and West Virginia. But we do know that Illinois growth was generally consistent with that of the US at large, where the Latino population grew by about 11.6 million individuals. Right here is a breakdown of Illinois population by race and ethnicity in 2020. In 2020, the number of Latinos living in Illinois was 2,337,410 individuals, or 18% of the state's population. You'll notice that other race and ethnicities include 58% white, 14% Black, 6% Asian, and 4% other. Similar to the national comparison that we showed earlier, here's the change in the number of people living in Illinois by race and ethnicity between 2010 and 2020. Between that 10-year gap, the Latino population in Illinois grew by 309,833 individuals, or 15%, while the state's overall population loss was 18,114 individuals, or negative 0.14%. And again, as mentioned earlier, the largest growth of race and ethnicity was the Latino community in the state. This is a very interesting, telling chart that you're seeing here, which is the percent of the total population that is Latino living in Illinois, in Chicago, and the Chicagoland counties between 2010 and 2020. And what you see here, obviously a few numbers to kind of look at, but what I want to point out is the largest percent increase occurred in Kendall County at 5%, the 5% increase there. Then it was followed by Lake and McHenry County at 4% increase. The total population change, or raw numbers, the largest, did occur in Cook County, which had an increase of 138,106 Latinos. Then it was followed by Lake County at 31,975 Latinos. And then finally, Will County had the third largest growth at over 25,000. Another very telling chart here, which shows the percent of the Latino population living in Illinois by selected regions, 2010 and 2020. You'll see here that the Chicago region between 2010 and 2020, the proportion of the state's Latino population living in Chicago actually decreased from 38% to 35%, which was a decrease of 3%. But I will note that while Chicago's percentage went down, every other region here, so Collier counties, Cook County, and the rest of the state, those percentages actually went up, which is really telling and really continues the narrative that has been going on in previous census efforts. I will note that the total in the Cook County percentage does not include Chicago, and the total in the Collier County percentage does not include Cook County. So they're all individual separate categories there. This is also, I think, a very telling slide. As I mentioned earlier, the total gain in Latino population in Illinois between 2010 and 2020 was 309,833. This kind of breaks down the raw numbers. I talked about percentages earlier, but here are the raw numbers. So the total gain in Chicago was 40,656. The total gain in Cook County minus Chicago was 97,361. The total gain in the rest of the state minus Cook County and Chicago was 171,816 Latinos. So essentially 55% of the state's Latino population growth was outside of Cook County. This is something also that has been talked about the past few weeks since the census numbers have come out. For the first time ever, Latinos are the second largest racial group in the state of Illinois, in Cook County, and the city of Chicago. You will note that, or I'll note that before in the state of Illinois and Cook County, that was the case. This is the first time for the city of Chicago. But again, for all three large groups, it's the first time that all three are the largest, second largest racial group of the state. Cook County and Chicago. Then finally here, so again, the census numbers that were released and really what this analysis is looking at is limited in detail. The census numbers that were released in August provide a broad overview of the population shifts between 2010 and 2020. Beginning in March 2022, the Census Bureau will release the 2020 census data related to socioeconomic conditions, such as educational attainment, home ownership, income, household size, poverty, and country of birth. The forum is planning to release a series of publications providing detailed analysis of these changes. So please stay tuned. I'm hoping that we can do something similar in a webinar form, but please stay in touch with us so we can ensure that you receive that data and that information. All right, perfect. So as I mentioned, that was the presentation. We'll make sure that this information gets out to folks so you can take a deeper look into it. But I do want to first introduce our panelists, and then I'll ask our first panelist to take it over. So today we are very fortunate to have Arturo Vargas, CEO of the Naleo Educational Fund. We have Osvaldo Alvarez, current executive director of the Chicago Workers Collaborative, but he is the former census director for the state of Illinois. And I may note that it was the inaugural office of the state of Illinois, so the first census director that we've had. And then finally, we have Sylvia Puente, who I'm sure all of you know, president and CEO of the Latino Policy Forum. So with that, I'm going to ask Arturo to, if he can come on video, and I will give you the microphone.
Thank you so much, Roberto, and thank you to the Latino Policy Forum for the invitation to join you today and to share some thoughts about the larger picture nationally about the census data and a little bit more insight of what we've seen about Illinois. Next slide. And just as a reminder, Naleo Educational Fund is a national organization. Our mission is to empower Latinos to participate in the American political process. The census is the foundation of that. And our current board chair is a neighbor of yours, Mara Calendario Reardon from Northwest Indiana. Next slide. Roberto went through some very comprehensive data on the Illinois Latino population. And the one thing I would like to underscore about the Latino population that we learned from the 2020 census overall is how significant the share is of our population that is under 18 years of age, the vast majority of which are US born citizens. In fact, while we're 18% of the US population, we're more than 0.25% of America's children and young people under 18. So when we say that the future of the United States is Latino, this is what we're referring to. And in fact, young people overall in the country, the population of all young people declined by 1.4%, but the number of young Latinos actually increased by 9.5%. Next slide. And we see this evident in the share of young people in all states. So in Illinois, while Latinos are 18.2% of the state population, and that's a remarkable parallel to the national share of the US Latino population, Latino youth in Illinois are 25% of Illinois' children and young people. Again, a remarkable parallel. So in some ways, Illinois' population really mirrors the national demographics of the nation. Next slide. One of the things we learned about this census is that people are moving from rural areas to urban areas. In fact, that as we have been analyzing the redistricting data, we've seen how the population in rural areas of Latinos has also declined. We saw this in the Rio Grande Valley, for example, but in the urban areas and in areas near big cities, that's where the Latino population has very much increased, as you saw by the color counties, and Chicago's right up there in that regard. Next slide. We talked a little bit about the growing diversity of the nation and what this means. And one of the reasons why the data on race and ethnicity is so rich in the 2020 census is because of the way that the Census Bureau improved the coding and collection of race and Hispanic origin data. It's not perfect. One of the fundamental flaws in the way the Census Bureau continued to ask everybody what their race or Hispanic origin was is that there were two separate questions, even though the Bureau wanted to use a combined question and even add an additional category called MENA, Middle Eastern North African. That didn't happen because the Trump administration's Office of Management and Budget did not allow that to go forward. However, because of the Bureau's improvement in coding, we saw much more diversity, including the decline of the white population. Ironically now, the nation's second largest race group is no longer African-American. It used to be non-Hispanic whites, African-Americans, and then Asians in terms of race. Now the second largest race group is a category called some other race, which OMB says doesn't exist. And if you study the composition of who said there were some other race, over 90% of those respondents are Latinos. So Latinos not identifying themselves or with the white or black categories, but saying, I'm Latino, that's my racial category, I therefore must be of some other race or multiracial. Next slide. We talked about the what happened in Illinois with the decline of population, but if you study this chart, Illinois is not alone in states that had a decline in its non-Hispanic population and an increase in its Hispanic population. So you'll see there was a similar dynamic of a loss of non-Latino population that was compensated by an increase of Latino population. Of course, Mississippi and West Virginia just lost population overall, but they still had an increase in Latinos. And then you see these other states that had a loss of non-Hispanic population and an increase of Hispanic population. Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Rhode Island. And one of the things that we thought Rhode Island would experience was a loss of one of its 2 congressional seats. It managed to hold on in large measure because of the increase of Latino population. Next slide. And we also need to talk about, if you can go to the next slide, the accuracy of the 2020 count. There was an initial narrative that because the population of Latinos increased so much that there obviously was no undercount. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, as we studied the apportionment data when they were released in April, we started to smell smoke about a possible serious undercount of Latinos. When large Latino population states that were expected to gain congressional seats gained either none or less than expected. I'm talking about Arizona, that gained no additional congressional seat. Texas, they picked up 2 instead of 3 or 4. And Florida, they only picked up 1 seat when it was expected to pick up 2 seats. One of the remarkable things about those 3 states, they had very little to absolutely no state investment in census outreach. So there's just too much coincidence here about what happened in those states and the Latino population. So we're going to be looking forward to the release of something called the Post-Enumeration Survey. That is the benchmark evaluation of the 2020 census, which will tell us definitively the extent of undercounts and overcounts of different population groups in the country. Next slide. But even with the release of the data that we saw, already there is growing evidence of a Latino undercount. The Bureau published something in late 2019 called demographic analysis. And it was their estimates of what the population count would be in the 2020 census by looking at actual births, deaths, and migration numbers over the past 10 years, over the decade. Now, the 2020 census came in the low estimates. An analysis already has been done of the Latino population in the demographic analysis. And unfortunately, we only have data in the demographic analysis of Latinos under the age of 30, because it wasn't until 1990 that all states started collecting Hispanic origin data on birth and death certificates. But even looking at the Latino youth population, already the foremost demographer on children in the country, Dr. William O'Hare, has done an analysis that suggests that the undercount of very young Latino children is in fact greater in 2020 than it was in 2010. Next slide. So we need more analysis to fully understand the extent of the accuracy of Census 2020. Now, the Bureau is doing a terrific job of being transparent with talking about its different metrics that it used in counting the population. How many people responded by mail? How many responded online? How many people were counted using administrative records and imputation and proxies? They're being very, very transparent about that to show that the data they collected is of high quality. That's great. But the point we need to make is we don't think they collected all the data, that there in fact is a serious undercount in Census 2020 of the Latino population. Next slide. And this has implications for a myriad of issues, including redistricting. So not only do we have the issue of state legislatures and even commissions drawing congressional and other lines to the detriment of Latinos and negating our political power, like we've seen in Texas, like we've seen in Colorado, and apparently also in Illinois. You add to that the fact that the data itself may be flawed because it does not fully account for all Latinos. That just makes it even more difficult to translate our numbers into true political representation. Next slide. So we have some work to do. And so we're going to be working to make sure that these congressional seats that were won and lost by the different states reflect the true population increase that each of these states experienced, even when there was population loss or congressional seat loss. There was no Latino population loss. In fact, it was an increase across the country. Next slide. So thank you for the opportunity to offer these thoughts and perspectives, and look forward to the next panelist.
Thank you, Arturo. Really appreciate that presentation. Let me unshare, or I unshared it. Let me look at our agenda here. We're going to ask our second panelist, Oswaldo, to come on to the video, if you will. And Oswaldo, if you can, tell us some of your key takeaways of the census campaign here in Illinois. We just want to know a little bit more around that experience and anything else you'd like to add to this conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Roberto. Thank you, Arturo, for that presentation, and thank you, Silvia, for putting this panel together. One of the things that I keep on telling people when they ask me about my experience with the census is that I tell them that this is the first time in my life where I have 100% of targets. And I tell people to just take a moment to reflect on what 100% means. There's no targeted marketing. It's everyone, right? And so one of the things that I keep on telling people is that one of the things that a big piece of what the census was to really think about how fluid, in terms of the Latino community, how fluid is Latino identity in order to convince every single person to get counted. I mentioned earlier, the state invested over $48 million. We had over 400 nonprofits doing this work, and in the state of Illinois. And what was interesting is that we, based on all of our efforts, we proved almost everyone wrong, every demographer wrong, in terms of where, not only in terms of the city of Chicago, but then the other places that actually experience growth. For example, places like Elgin, places like Hanover Park, Waukegan. These are places that if you go into the Census Bureau website right now, it still shows that it had predicted about a 3 to 4% decline rate, when in fact, all of these places gained population, and the population that it gained were Latino. One of the pieces that I like to mention is in my own, based on my own experience doing this work with the census, is that the census also, as we were doing civic engagement across, it also challenged, not only did it challenge all of our nonprofits and all of the work, right? But it also challenged everyone on many of our notions on who we thought were those Latinos who were less likely to want to fill out a census form. So in the very beginning, we were, of course, we were very aware of all of the messages that were coming from the White House. Of course, COVID hit, so imagine trying to do a census without being able to door knock. All of these conflicting messages and what have you. And so, of course, one of the initial ideas was that we needed to target the undocumented immigrant community who were afraid of completing the census. It was very interesting to note that halfway through the census, and I would say this like starting in July of last year, in July and August, we noticed that a lot of the people who we were actually targeting, and again, this is what I'm telling you about the targeted marketing, when we were approached them, people would tell us that they had already completed the census form. And so for us, it wasn't until halfway through the campaign that we started to realize that many of the people who were not completing the census were the children of these individuals. It wasn't necessarily the parents, it was their kids. And it was interesting to see this, like halfway, I'm telling you, it was like the back of the yards, Little Village, they had like only 35% what's it called, response rate. And then when you look really deep into the demographics, into who was responding, who was not responding, it was really interesting to correlate how the millennial population of these places, which usually is over 40, which in both of those places last year was over 40%, these were the populations that were not responding. So then it required us to go a little bit deeper on why were they not responding? What was the part of them that they were just not interested? And I'm telling you, I was challenged by people in the streets where they would tell me, I'm not going to fill out the census. And they would ask me, what are you going to do? Are you going to deport me, or what's going on, right? And it was really interesting for me to see that, to have people who I went to school with, people who I related with, if you will, tell me that they were not interested in filling out the census. And again, as I went a little bit deeper, is when I started to realize that a lot of the children of immigrant parents, of Latino parents, I realized that they learned really well from their parents in terms of how to be off the grid. And I say this in that, whereas the parents were at one point selling tamales, their children are probably Instagrammers, beauticians, electricians, selling Avon, what have you. And what was very interesting for me to see was how many Latinos participate in informal economies and actively choose to live off the grid. And for me, that was interesting, because then I come in with a census form and I ask them to fill out a census form, and they're like, That is exactly what I've been trying not to do. And so for me, you know, one of the biggest takeaways was me having to pivot the entire strategy halfway through the census from investing on commercials on Univision in Spanish and what have you, to investing in reggaeton, Instagram, TikTok, pivoting that. We did that, the numbers went up. And it was very interesting for me to see that, and for me to say this to everyone, that we have a lot of notions of who, again, and I keep on telling people, this was 100%. So my job was everyone, right? We have a lot of notions of who are the ones who are not participating. And many times, one of the things that we learned through the census was that many of the people who are not participating are not the people who we're talking about, are people who are right in front of us, are people who are delivering a potbelly sandwich to the Grubhub. Those are people who, again, they are living off the grid and they are doing this on purpose. And so anyway, I just wanted to say this. This was a big takeaway for me, just because we saw how, I'm telling you, how we pivoted, we changed, we had all of that. And Illinois, the city of Chicago, I'm telling you, Hanover Park, you name it, they all saw an increase in population, and that increase was thanks to the Latino community. So again, thank you so much, Sylvia. Thank you so much, Arturo. And I am here for any questions.
So quickly, Osvaldo, it's really interesting, right, that you mentioned, you know, the demographic that, you know, we're filling out the census were the ones that we thought we would have more issues with. I'm curious to know, you know, going forward, what are, you know, kind of the lessons learned? Are those approaches something that will continue, you think? We have to look at things differently because of those takeaways? If you can briefly talk about that, and then also briefly curious to know if you can mention, if you have it available, the percentages of the completion in majority districts compared to other communities, Latinos versus non-Latinos. I don't know if you can talk about a little bit about that, if possible.
For sure. I mean, I think that, you know, for me, you know, one of the biggest messages that I would like for people to also hear is that as we are talking about vaccination rates, as we are talking about civic engagement and people voting, as we're talking about all of these different things, I do ask everyone to take a step and it's like take a pause and think on who is not participating, and actually ask yourselves if that's intentional. And I say this and that, and I say this and that. What that is when I say that people live off the grid, I really mean it in that this is whereas the parents were working in temp and staffing jobs, the kids are working in gig jobs. And for me, you know, what's interesting about that informal economy again is that is an economy where you intentionally are off the grid. And when you are intentionally off the grid, you don't have to report everything. Maybe you don't have to, what have you, right? This is how we figured out how to make it happen. And so that is just one thing that I would ask everyone to think about. And in terms of like response rates, for example, even though like the response rate in Illinois was about 74% response rates, and many of these communities, as I said, like right now that I said Hanover Park, the response rates were like 79%, 80%. And, you know, and I'm telling you, we had to get very creative from having an ultimate quinceañera contest in Hanover Park to having taquicensos everywhere, you know, get your free taco and fill out your census form, to we were in the laundromats and we'll pick up your wash and dry when you fill out the census. This is what we were doing, right? We also use the census as a way to have people, have Latinos claim their identity. That is another common denominator that we found out about the census, is that Latinos, we actually love to be called Chicagoans, or to be called like I'm from Elgin or I'm from Waukegan. So we picked up on that pride. We ended up with a whole campaign of Soy Latino from Elgin, Soy Latino from Aurora. And that was like, you know, it became trendy, right? And that was the other part of what we realized that we needed to do. So yeah.
Perfect, Osvaldo. No, thank you so much for your answers and for your work. Obviously, the rates that we got wouldn't have been possible without your vision, your office's vision. So thank you so much. We'll ask you to stick around to answer some questions from the audience in just a bit. But we will ask our final panelist, Sylvia Puente, to come on to the video. There you are, Sylvia. Of course, Sylvia, I mentioned earlier around policy implications. Can you kind of talk about some of the policy implications of these census numbers?
So, Roberto, there's a couple of technical questions in the chat. I don't know if you've had a chance to go through them, if maybe you want to address at least a couple of those.
I think we're going to address those, Sylvia, as soon as, if you can just, talk, give your portion, and then we'll address the questions in the chat.
Okay, well, really,
questions as far as the presentation, or just people can't view their, I'm sorry,
say that again.
technical questions in regards to people not being able to view the video, or
technical questions on the census data and the numbers and some.
Oh, okay.
But
Yeah,
you're going to go through those now, so we can address them in the chat after
That's
this.
right.
Okay. So, folks, we'll get to some of your questions. Well, let me pick up off on where Oswaldo. Let me start with where Oswaldo left off on some of the implications of this data, and of course, it's just high-level implications because there are many, many more from what you're saying. But what Oswaldo is sharing to me is really new news, and something that I think that we need to consider is that from my perspective, we know that we've always had our undocumented population, which includes, our madres and our padres and our elders, and obviously our DACA population and the challenges that they face in terms of regularizing their status in this nation. And from the data that we've looked at the Latino Policy Forum in the past, we've had an upwardly mobile Latino population. We have about a third of our community that's our households that now earn over $75,000 a year. This is from past data because we don't have the data yet to update it with the census. But that to me was a hopeful sign of, we have an upwardly mobile population and that our college graduation rates are going. We have more households with greater household income. But what I think Oswaldo is really crystallizing, certainly for me, is we have a third sector, if you will, of our Latino population who are US-born Latinos who are learning to live off the grid in the gig economy. And I have a real question then on how do we think about policy that enriches and enables them to have better jobs, jobs in the formal economy, jobs with benefits, right? Or are we going to have this US-born Latino community that is going to be, not that there's anything wrong with working in the gig economy, if that's your choice, but that has limited opportunities. So how do we create additional opportunities through our public policy, through our workforce initiatives for that sector of the community that Oswaldo is speaking to? To me, I think that's really pretty profound and something that we all need to consider in all of the work that we do. So just to underscore a few of the things that have been cited, and I'm going to repeat it with Oswaldo and Arturo saying that in the nation in Illinois, we know that there was probably a significant Latino undercount. So we don't know how much it is, but we know that it's probably higher than in past years. Even with that, the state, as the data showed, increased its Latino population by 309,000. 15%, and we are now behind whites the second largest racial ethnic group in this at the state level, at the Cook County level, and at the city of Chicago. And when you saw that chart on counties, oh my goodness, formally we can count that we saw increases in every county, right? So our population is still growing. But frankly, I was stunned when I first looked at this data to see that in Kane County now, and I'm old enough to remember when Kane County was really a majority white county, 1 out of every 3 people living in Kane County right now is a Latino. And that's probably an undercount. So there was a question a little bit in the chat. What we now know is that 85% of the growth of the Latino community was outside of Chicago. So of those 309,000 new Latinos, 85% of them were out of Chicago. We saw a growth in Chicago's Latino community, which we did not see in 2010, by the way. So, but we did see a growth of 40,000 in 2000, in 2020. But I don't know, we don't know if that's, we know that gentrification is still happening in our communities. We know there's growth, substantial growth, and the majority of our growth happening outside of the city of Chicago. but we don't know what's really driving growth in Chicago and the overall impact of both gentrification, but the ramifications of the mortgage foreclosure crisis, where a lot of people lost their homes and moved outside of the city. So bottom line around that even with the undercount, Illinois' Latino population still grew substantially, and we see that in all the counties. Arturo spoke about redistricting, and I hope that you all saw the statement that we just put out and statements we have put out on redistricting, and I'll ask the team to put those in the chat. I'm not gonna belabor this, but state the facts, which is even with a 309,000 person increase in our Latino community in the state of Illinois, our legislators and our governor signed maps that actually decreased the number of House districts by 1 and decreased substantially by 5 or 6 or more Black majority districts in the state of Illinois. So the Latino population grew. We have fewer opportunities to elect the representatives of our choice from Latino majority districts. And I'm pausing there for emphasis. Now, we have also moved to an era where we are seeing Latinos being elected from non-Latino majority districts. And that is a maturation of, I think, all of the political process and people who vote, that people from, especially in our suburban communities, are electing Latinos from non-majority districts. But the bottom line is that our legislature passed and our governor signed maps that reduce our ability to impact Latino legislators by creating fewer Latino majority districts. That's significant. The Latino Policy Forum, in terms of policy recommendations, working with some of our partners, the Illinois Latino Agenda, which if you're not familiar with, we did a major recruitment event last week, find that on our website, and Illinois Unidos, which is focused on the healthcare crisis. We did numerous conversations, focus groups, engagement with community leaders to ask what are the priorities at this moment in time. And we have developed a very substantial memo that highlights those priorities and the need for small business development, for mental health counseling, for digital learning for our youth, and certainly for more cash assistance and housing assistance for our families who are in crisis, who have been impacted by this COVID crisis. And we are asking for substantial investment from the state of Illinois in our Latino community to come from the American Rescue Plan dollars. And we will be meeting with the governor's office on that in the coming week, and really hope that many of our recommendations for resources and investment from our community-based organizations to our families, to our households, are considered in the state budget to be developed. So we will also make that, put that memo in the chat. It's our wish list. It's something that we're asking for after substantial conversations with many, many community leaders. But we have, I mean, what I'm pleased to say is working with this broad coalition of groups, we actually have data and numbers, and we're making our case. And certainly it's not everything that our community needs, but we think it is some of the highest priorities in which we continue to get investment. And we certainly intend to work with our legislative leaders and our governor's office to see how much of that can be in our budget. And I'll just sort of just end with this idea that certainly as more census data becomes available, because right now all of the data to do all of the analysis is not yet available, we will continue to provide analysis and updates. We will and have written a couple of our blogs. If you have not seen, please go and look at our blogs written by our research director, Noreen Segru, who's our former professor, who really is speaking to, and one of the other themes that we're still trying to get our hands around, but I want to put out to you, is that pre-COVID, the Latino community really was making substantial gains in home ownership, in increased wages and resources, in increased healthcare coverage, in educational attainment. So many of those gains have been thwarted because of COVID. And made that sound for emphasis. The number of our students that have had to drop out of college and not return to college. We were on a trajectory with more of our students being college enrolled. The blog will speak to the substantial number now that are no longer in college. So there's just so much more I think that we need to consider and continue to work together to advance our community, to address the losses that we've had due to COVID, even at the same time. And I do think of the Latino community oftentimes as a paradox, because we have this very dramatic story of real challenge. Even at the same time, with our population growth, we are still driving home ownership growth in the state, and we're driving labor market growth in the state. So we are still driving a lot of the things that require a healthy economy for the state of Illinois. And the Latino community is a driver of that, especially given the population losses that we've seen. So this is a real paradox, I think, that confronts us right now in terms of how we move forward. But bottom line, we must adjust what COVID broke in our community as we consider all of our forthcoming public policy to really address the dramatic losses that we've seen since COVID has impacted and devastated so many in our community.
Thank you, Sylvia. We're going to pivot over to our Q&A section. We have about 11 minutes. So many questions, great questions. Arturo, Osvaldo, if you can bring up your videos, thank you. Let me switch to gallery form here so you can see all of us. So the first question, and I don't know who would want to answer this, is a question around, will you address the fact that Latinos have more self-identification options from 2010 to 2020? This has to be mentioned when discussing the huge drop in whites and the increase in Latino Hispanic. Anyone like to answer that?
Well, I think I sort of addressed that when I talked about the changes that the Census Bureau did to the coding of responses. They still proceeded with the flawed two-question approach, asking everybody first, are you Hispanic, yes or no? And then asking, what is your race? And many Latinos not identifying with any of the racial options that they checked off some of the race as their racial background. The Bureau wanted to correct that by going through a combined question, but was not able to proceed. And we're advocating for the Biden administration to move forward with returning to that research-based method of collecting race and Hispanic origin data.
Thank you, Arturo. Next question. The decline from 38% to 35% in Chicago seems to be slower than the decline in previous years. Is that the case? Also, each of the other three, and I'm assuming the different regions got 1% of the 3 drop of Chicago. Overall, the population in the city grew. What does it say about the push out of gentrification? If someone wants to, maybe Osvaldo, Sylvia, if you want to address that.
So Osvaldo, do you have insight into that at all?
I mean, in terms of the 2 neighborhoods in Chicago that saw a decrease in Latino population and an increase in white population were Pilsen and Logan Square. So those 2, it was very evident. It was in the city of Chicago it did happen in terms of gentrification. Still, it doesn't mean, I mean, there were increases of people that we saw living in different neighborhoods of Chicago, places where we already know that people are living, and now they just got counted, if you will. So, so all that to say that, I mean, as you saw, like in the numbers, you know, Chicago as a city overall saw an increase in population. So, and again, much of this was driven by the Latino increase of population. So, so yeah, I think that would be my, my 2 cents there.
Yeah, and I'll also just add, and I'm sure this is I'd like to ask if this is true in the nation too, that this population growth we know from other data is primarily being driven by US born Latinos, that we know that immigration and migration has really slowed down. That was the driving force of our population growth in the 80s and the 90s. That is no longer true. It's really by US born individuals and the children of our immigrant population. With that, those families having children is what's causing a lot of the increase, I would argue, both in Chicago and in the other areas of the state.
right? And then the decline in birth rates for non-Hispanic whites. You know, that population is declining in size while ours continues to increase.
We have more families of childbearing age and we're having more babies. Is that it, Arturo?
More than non-Hispanic whites, but not as many as we used to. Because even our birth rates in the Latino community are declining.
So one question, I think this is towards Arturo. Will the PES survey actually adjust any of the Census 2020 published numbers?
No, unfortunately, we are stuck with the apportionment and redistricting data that has been released by the Census Bureau. What we're hoping is that if the PES shows significant and meaningful undercounts of Latinos and other populations and overcounts of others, that they use that to adjust, for example, the American Community Survey going forward, which collects population characteristics and perhaps is used by state and local policymakers to have a better sense of what their true population size is. So when it comes to making policy decisions, and then, hopefully adjusted numbers can be used for the distribution of federal funds so that that money goes to our communities where the need really exists. So we're hoping that the PES numbers will be used for those purposes.
Next question, I think, is a very interesting one. Would like to hear from all three of you, if you will. The population in many rural communities where these increases were driven solely by Latinos, can you address that? In fact, rural America is becoming more diverse. Anything around that? We talked about the collar counties, Sylvia, but really understanding why this is happening.
Why the diversity is happening, or the growth?
Why the diversity, why the growth in rural areas in Illinois and even in different parts of the country. What are the reasons, essentially? What are your thoughts?
Arturo, would you like to lead on that?
Well, actually, what the census showed is that people are migrating to urban areas. Either they're moving to large cities or near large cities in metropolitan areas. I think you saw that in Chicago and Chicagoland. With the collar counties, you're seeing that as well in Los Angeles and Dallas and the 10 largest cities, and some loss of rural population in some states. We saw that significantly with Latino populations in Texas and some in New Mexico, where rural areas actually had population declines, but the big cities had population increases.
What I would say, and I think a caution for all of this, and this comes from some work that the Metropolitan Planning Council did on the cost of segregation a couple of years ago. And at that point, they predicted, and now that we have the data, we can see the extent to which it's come true, that as a Latino population grows, especially in suburban communities, we are seeing more diversity, but we're not necessarily seeing more integration. What we are seeing is more concentration of Latinos in particular communities, into particular suburbs, or as I always think about otro lado, on the other side of the tracks of particular communities, right? That we're not necessarily seeing integration happen. And I think that is a concern as we think about public policy implications of that around the region, is that diversity doesn't necessarily lead to more integration. And there are pros and cons to that, right? Because there are advantages to our communities living in ethnic enclaves where people look like them and they go to school, children go to school with children that look like them. But then what are the advantages and disadvantages of that, of having a truly more integrated society? Or are we just replicating Chicago's pattern of segregation in our suburbs?
Mm-hmm. And if I just may say something regarding the outreach that we did, when we were looking for different pockets of Latinos across the state of Illinois, one of the things that we had to remember was that the markets had already done some sort of analysis. So we would just like Google, where are the staffing firms? And based on where those staffing firms were, we knew that there were going to be Latinos living around there. So we would canvass those places heavily. So for me, that was just an interesting for us to also know that the census is like a formal way that that we count people. But there's also other again, like in this case, manufacturing and a lot of these factory jobs, they canvass places, right? And they have like staffing firms around there for temp jobs and what have you. And you know, that's how we found a lot of Latinos across the state of Illinois.
Hmm.
This will probably be maybe the last question, but there was a comment in the chat around, some are saying that there's been an exaggeration around how Latinos have been counted. Do you think that's the case? And do you wonder why that's being said or being kind of floated around in regards to the actual growth of Latinos, both in the state of Illinois and nationally?
No, I would say that the evidence actually is building that there was a significant undercount of Latinos. Again, when we looked at the apportionment data, the fact that states with large Latino populations did not gain as many seats as had been projected, when we looked at the redistricting data and compare that to estimates and research that shows that Latino children were undercounted at higher rates in 2020 than 2010. And even local communities reporting that they, in fact, over the past decade have had to build schools and new housing developments, and then the census telling them that they actually have population loss. And these were in heavily Latino areas. In fact, there was some news stories about this out of communities in Arizona. I think if you build all this together, the evidence is pointing to the Bureau did the best job possible under the circumstances, but the circumstances were just the most challenging, I think, in history, given both external factors, the pandemic and so forth, and internal factors, including the efforts to politicize the census by the Trump administration, efforts to add a citizenship question. All of that had lingering effects to suppress Latino turnout or Latino participation.
And Oswaldo, maybe you could just elaborate again what you said earlier on, even with increased census count in Latino majority communities, you still saw that there were a lot of people who were refusing to respond to the census.
That's absolutely right. I think that even within, it was interesting. And again, and for me, the most interesting part that I really need to say is that it was the English-speaking Latinos who were challenging me more so than the Spanish-speaking Latinos. And I'm telling you this, like it was halfway. I saw that. I'm telling you, we had to pivot from commercials in Spanish to commercials in English, targeting Latinos. And it was just, and for me to be in these lines and for me to be in these laundromats and have to talk about the census, about the power of the census, and see how people were like evading this conversation. To me, it was very telling on maybe there is something that I'm missing about my own people as I'm even approaching them, right? And so anyway, so I would tell you, there were still many people who did not complete the census. And I know that, you know, and for me, you know, it was no surprise, if you will, when we went into these neighborhoods to see how many people live there and to see what the response rates were based on all of these things. So anyway, yeah.
You know, I could just add, you know, one of the challenges we have with the Census Bureau as it was preparing for 2020 is that it made synonymous Latino outreach with Spanish language outreach. The official national Latino census approach was, oh, as long as we do outreach in Spanish, we have the Latino population covered. In fact, we had to force the Bureau to hold at least 2 focus groups in English with Latinos, and making the point, if all you do is advertise on Univision and Telemundo and Azteca, etc., you're missing the majority of the Latino population.
Yes. Thank you, Arturo. Very true.
Well, we're at time. Let me just offer my personal thanks to Roberto and the entire Latino Policy Forum team that really helped to put this together. And then of course, we're all stronger together. So really want to thank Arturo for taking time from your very busy schedule to join us today. And Oswaldo, thank you. We know that you moved on to other efforts, but as you shared, you had this very intense job and then you were gone. So hopefully this gave you a little bit of closure, but happy to have you come back and share more. And the forum, obviously, please, and Roberto is probably going to give this commercial, sign up for all of our channels. We have groundbreaking education work that we're doing, that we're sharing with our Chicago public schools, and have a huge event over this groundbreaking research that's happening at the end of October that we'd invite you to. And really stay attuned to all of our social media channels for all the work that we're doing. Roberto?
Yes, just echo everything that Sylvia said. I will add that we will be following up with folks who registered and send out this video, the presentation, and then stay tuned for next spring's presentation and our follow-up there. So I want to thank everyone. Hope everyone has a great weekend and take care. Gracias.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
That's fun.